Are you ready to have your brains rewired? And I'm not just talking about the free alcohol, although that is actually maybe more relevant than you might think. We'll come on to that. We're obviously going to be talking about testing. Actually, this talk is not a particularly technical talk. It's not in terms of code. I'm not going to show any code, I think. I think I took it all out, because I had some slides with some C++ from the previous version. I didn't have time to convert to it. So we're going to be talking more about the philosophy of TDD, psychology of TDD, and even the neuroscience of TDD. We will even talk a little bit about what TDD actually is. That's not the main thrust of this talk. I'm not going to try and convince you to use TDD or why it's so good. I've done other talks on that. Do look for Swift-driven development, talk I did a few years ago on that subject. This one's going to be more about the surrounding stuff, or that, particularly the psychology, how we can get the best out of it, and how we can let TDD get the best out of us as well, and that's really key. So, let's just start right with the fundamentals. Just testing. Why do we actually write tests in the first place? We'll start with the why, although I'm actually going to take that off for a minute and say, do we write tests? So, I'm going to ask a few questions actually. So, who here regularly writes tests for their code? Not necessarily all of their code or before, but just regularly writes tests as part of their process. So, it's probably about 15–20%. Yep, that sounds about right. Right, who's currently working on a code base with at least 90% test coverage? Few people, yeah, that's quite normal. This is fine, there's no judgment here. We're just setting the stage. All right, final question, this should involve everyone now. Who thinks that they should be writing more tests?
Yeah.
Almost everyone. There's a few people saying no. We'll turn you around as well, don't worry. All right. So let's bring that why back in. I'm actually not quite ready to address this question just yet. I'm going to come back to why we don't write tests. Or, so just to include everyone, why do we not write enough tests? So I actually do TDD training, and as part of that I do a few flipboard exercises where I ask a question and then I take all the responses, put them on the flipboard. There's always one or two I've never thought of before, and I take a photo, and that's my list for next time. So I'm just going to pull out just 4 reasons that come up a lot that may resonate with you. This by no means exhaustive, but maybe they ring a bell. Perhaps you think that just writing tests is just extra work. Yeah, that's not what you actually wanted to do. It's just some extra stuff you have to do. Yeah, I know this thing works because I've seen it work some other way. Why do I have to write tests to tell us the same thing? Extra work. And as a result of that, it's going to slow you down. It's extra work. It's going to take more time. It's going to take longer. And it's going to distract you from what you're actually doing, which might be the fun stuff. I want to do this really cool thing, but I've got to write all these tests instead. It's tedious. And in fact, that's the last thing. It's boring. Maybe writing test code is just the boring part of writing code, not the bit we're actually motivated by. We're going to come back to these questions, but say maybe some of those resonate with you. But I do want to get back to this question, why do we write tests then? We come up with some reasons why not. Some of us have said, we do write a lot of tests, there must be a reason we push through that. So again, taking some of the things I do on these flip chart sessions in my training, there's a few examples. Perhaps the most obvious one, maybe the first thing you think of, to catch bugs. Or perhaps put it another way, to prevent the bugs from getting in the first place. Very important, but by no means the only reason we write tests. How about this one? To encode our expectations. Maybe you haven't really thought about it this way. When you're writing a text, you're writing down what your expectation is of what code is meant to do. You had that idea in your mind already, which is why maybe you've been able to verify that by some other means, but you're actually writing it down in code. To catch regressions, slightly different to catching bugs. Maybe you found a bug in the wild, and you write a test that reproduced it, and now you know when you fixed it. And you keep that test in to make sure that bug never comes back. But even if you've never seen the bug in the wild, having a suite of tests you can run, make sure you never get that bug in the first place. That's still a regression test, so that's an important part as well. Here's another one maybe you haven't thought of. That's documentation. See some people nodding their heads, sagely. Most people either they think that's the most obvious thing in the world, or I've never thought of that. But how often do you hear someone say, you know, how does this code work? We're going to have a look at the tests. They'll show you. And there's a flip side to that, which is we often write tests that sort of probe at the dusty corners of our code, the bits we don't actually want people to really use. We just want to make sure it still functions there. So we do have to clearly mark which tests are valid to use as documentation and which are not. So there's different ways you can do that. We're not going to go into that today. But this is a section of reasons that we do write tests. Put up a few more, so still not exhaustive. I'm not going to go through these one by one. What I do want to point out is that all of the ones on the left there, in that sort of dark green, blue, we can get these benefits just from any type of test. But the ones on the right, in the green shade, we only get those benefits if we use TDD. So that's interesting. And they may seem a bit odd as well. We will come back to these. They will need a little bit more explaining. But before we come to that, come back to this set of reasons for not writing tests. Goodness of these. A little bit of a spoiler on the next slide. But what if I was to say to you that instead of tests being actually work, they can actually help you to avoid rework? And what if instead of slowing you down, they can actually speed you up? And if instead of distracting you from what you're doing, they can keep you focused on what matters. And of course, what if I said instead of them being boring, they were actually fun? Right. Now it gets interesting. Big question, of course, is how does this all happen? Why am I going to try to convince you of this? This is why we get into the psychology part of it. And in fact, I want to just take a moment to emphasize this really important fundamental principle that you're all going to be familiar with, but maybe we don't always think of it around these things, but it underpins everything we're going to talk about, which is that the brain, the human mind, is basically just a big association machine, a network of pathways. And this underpins not just our memory, but our behavior, mindsets, our moods, our productivity. All of these things all derived from this network of pathways. And when we think of things that way, a lot of other things just drop into place. And we're going to touch on that quite a bit. But we're going to look at this in three different ways. The first is habit forming. So this is perhaps the biggest part from psychology we're going to draw on. And most of what we're going to talk about generalizes to any type of habit forming or habit breaking, but we're going to apply it specifically to TDD, and there's some reasons that this works really well. But of course, you know, one of the biggest reasons that people stop doing TDD after they started is they never get into the habit of it. They do it for a while and then it peters out. I mean, today is the 23rd of January. How many people started a regular exercise routine at the gym on the 1st of January, and by this time of the month, it's already started to tail off? It's the same thing, same principle. Then we're going to step it up a notch and look at what I call dopamine triggers. That's really interesting. And finally, something I call externalize your brain, which is a little bit different. To get to that, we're going to talk about two cycles. Not these ones. This is actually my sons, they are twins. This was taken about 9 years ago now, so they're a bit bigger. But the two cycles I want to talk about. Well, the first one is, of course, the TDD cycle. If you've ever looked at TDD before, then you will have seen something like this. Here's my one. So this is where I'm just going to briefly describe what TDD is and how it works. And I should have said at the start, of course, for those that don't know, TDD stands for test-driven development. So driving your development or your design through tests. And you have to really strictly follow this cycle. And it's another place that people slip up. They think they can skip steps or just avoid them altogether. But it doesn't work that way. You have to follow it to the letter. So we always start by writing a failing test. That's the red box. We sometimes call the cycle red-green refactor, by the way, after the colours. And if you're using a test framework, you'll often see the failures printed out in red and successes in green. But you have to start with a failing test. It's not just enough to write a test first, it also has to fail, and that has some implications to it. It means that when you do make the test pass, you know it's because of the code you just wrote, not because of something else you hadn't really considered before. There's some other implications as well, but we're short on time. The other thing is the test doesn't have to necessarily be an assertion in a test framework. It can just be some code that doesn't compile yet. The compiler becomes your test framework. That gives you one loop around the test slate, the TDD slate. Once you've got your failing test, then and only then you move on to the green stage, where we make that test pass. But it's write just the code to make the test pass. Again, this matters. We're not trying to go for clean, well-factored code at this stage. Sounds counterproductive. Again, a lot of TDD does initially, but we can actually just hack away at the code. We talked about hackathons just now. This is the fun part. Just hack the code until it works. And the test will tell you what it does, and you haven't broken any other code as well. And then we get on to the refactor step. Again, don't miss this, don't skip this. You won't always have anything to do, but this is the point where now your tests are all passing, you're all green. Now you can actually improve the structure of the code without changing the behavior. Bring in those clean code principles, good design principles, all of that sort of thing. If you don't do that, all you're doing is just hacking a code, and you're going up with a big ball of mud. So those two things are really important. And finally, we also get a place to ask the question, are we done? And it's important it's out here, rather than at the point that we're hacking away at code, where we're just thinking, what's the next fun thing I can do? Now we're thinking more about requirements. And then we go back around the cycle if necessary. So that's TDD in a nutshell. I actually do a 2-day training in TDD, so I've condensed that a lot. Maybe I'll come back another time and give you a fuller version. Now, before we look at how we can apply this, I want to bring in the other cycle. I said, say there's 2 cycles, and the other one is that habit loop, part of the habit forming. So, complete change of subject for a moment. You may have seen something like this before as well. Have you ever looked into the anatomy of habits, how to break habits? Really hard if you don't know what you're doing. It's actually hard even if you do, but it's definitely achievable. And usually when we talk about habits, we're talking about breaking bad habits. The reason it's really hard to do is because you can never actually just completely stop a habit once it's entrenched. You can only replace it with something else. Now in our case, bringing this back to TDD, the habit we want is that, well, we want to write code using tests. Well, we have an existing behavior there that we want to replace, which is writing code without tests. What we usually think of as a habit is actually the behavior step of this loop. That's the thing that's obvious. That's the thing we want to change. But the really important parts are the other two, the cue and the reward. And they're actually often very hard to identify, but you have to do that before you have a hope of changing it. Now in this case, I think the cue and the reward are reasonably straightforward. So the cue is, we're going to write some code. The behavior that we may already have is just writing. And the reward you get is just some immediate feedback. You see it running, it does the thing you want, you feel good about it. That's your little reward. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Then you go back round again. Now the thing about habits and how this works in your brain, remember that big association machine network of pathways. Every time you perform a behaviour given a cue, you're building an association in your brain between those two things. The reason that we do it in the first place is because of the reward. So another principle from psychology, you may have heard of, the pleasure-pain principle, is that at the most primitive level, we always want to move towards pleasure and away from pain. And that pleasure part is usually something immediate. We don't tend to be motivated at an instinctual level by long-term rewards. That's why sticking to the gym habit is so hard. The rewards are long-term, the immediate thing is pain. That's what we want to move away from. And it's similar here. The long-term reward is, we have this well-factored code base, we don't have a lower defect rate and so on. All the benefits that we're not going to go into, but they are there. But that pays off in a while. The immediate thing is, those things we looked at earlier. It takes more time, distracts from what you're doing, all that sort of thing. So the reward part's the problem. So let's just replace the behaviour. I'm going to say the behaviour you want is you want to write it with a test. But we want to keep the reward basically the same. Now, if you follow TDD, every time you write failing test, you then make it pass, and the tests go green. And it's really useful if you actually do have a framework that shows you in green, assuming you don't have colour deficiencies and that sort of thing. But whatever it is that visually gives you that indication that everything is now green, everything is now passing. There's a little feel-good factor to that. That's your reward. Pay attention to it. This is key. By focusing on that reward that you get, you're building a new habit, or a new version of the same habit in its place. And at the moment we're going to take this up a notch. But just that alone can be enough to, in time, replace the repeating habit with a new habit. Focusing on that new reward to replace the existing habit. Right, I've said that we'll take it up a notch. We will. Before we do that, one other thing to say about habits. It's hard not to follow a habit. We know this. Often to our detriment. But it works for good habits as well. So this comes with a warning. If you follow everything I'm going to tell you about this evening, after a while you may find it really difficult to write code without tests. Sometimes call this being test infected. I might go as far as to say test addicted. And I'm not making light of it. It's actually the same underlying principle. So be warned. But it does mean that you may take that thing that's hard to test, like I've got this network code or it's mostly UI and that sort of thing. Where's the logic? I can't pull it out. You will look for the ways and you will find them. You'll be surprised how much code you can pull out and test in isolation. But you need to establish the habit first. So let's take it up a notch and talk about dopamine triggers. So we're all familiar with dopamine, I'm sure. In fact, if you look on Wikipedia, it says, in popular culture and media, dopamine is often portrayed as the main chemical of pleasure. There's pleasure again, part of the pleasure-pain principle. But something's a little bit off here. It says in popular culture and media, it's often portrayed as that. Does that mean it's not actually the main chemical of pleasure? The article goes on to say that the current opinion in pharmacology is that dopamine instead confers motivational salience. So what's that? Well, if you're not familiar with the term, we can break it down. The motivational part, that should be fairly straightforward. We've already talked about motivation. But actually even the motive part of motivation implies movement, like locomotion. Remember that pain-pleasure principle, moving away from pain towards pleasure? You can see why those things are motivating, either negatively or positively. It's all part of the same thing. Right, all about the salience. If you're not familiar with the word salience in that form, maybe you're familiar with salient. Like the salient facts, you know that expression? meaning the important facts, or more accurately, the relevant facts. If we're looking for the relevant facts in a situation, then we're becoming more aware, more open to observation. And salience is that state of awareness, looking for the relevant facts. So motivational salience is being motivated to look for the relevant facts in the situation. They may be familiar with one of the many experiments they did with trained monkeys. In this one, they give them an opening and a lever to pull, and every time they pull the lever, it gives them a treat. And they think, great, they have the treat, pull the lever again, another treat, brilliant. Doesn't take them long to figure out they're going to get the treat every time. They know the pattern. And what they did is they measured the levels of dopamine in these monkeys. And initially it spiked. And then it tails off. They're still getting the treats, but after a while they just lose interest in it. They can go back, they can get that treat anytime they like. Got it all figured out. So they did another experiment where they only deliver the treat 50% of the time at random. And what happens then is really interesting. The dopamine never tails off. They maintain that motivation to learn what the pattern is, because that's what's going to get them the reward. That's motivational salience. Now what the interesting thing is here, particularly for us, is that this implies being primed for learning and for observation, which sounds like exactly the state of mind you want to be in if you're looking at some code that's not working. If you just found a bug in your code with a test, you're now primed to find out why that bug exists and how to fix it. So how does this all connect in? So remember the habit loop. We're looking for those rewards. Pass, pass, pass. Well, if it passed literally every time, it wouldn't be so interesting. But every now and then it's going to fail. And when it does, this kicks in. So the dopamine really dulls this up a notch. Plus you get that extra feeling of the feel-good factor mixed in with it as well. So what are the other things that can trigger dopamine when we're doing CBD? So we talked about seeing the test pass. If it happened every time, it wouldn't be as interesting. The fact that it fails from time to time, that's what gives you motivational salience. Similarly, seeing the test go from red to green is a slightly different thing. You know that it failed, you know it works because of what you just did. Except sometimes it doesn't. Or sometimes it didn't go red the first time. That whole race to green thing, the hacking away to get to the green stage, that can be quite fun as well. Again, sometimes it doesn't work quite the way you expected. Even the refactor stage, cleaning code without breaking anything. Lots of opportunities for extra dopamine in there as well. Pay attention to all of these things. Try to maximize them, because they're all going to strengthen the habit, but also the sense of fun. That's where that comes into it. All right, we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to skip on to the last section. Externalizing your brain. This one's a bit different. So, we may have heard this term that as humans we are open loop animals. We don't tend to thrive well in isolation. We need other people. And our communication style is sort of, we bounce things off other people. We think better in a group. Overall, I know certain people have different preferences, we're not talking about that. But this thing comes up again and again, and it turns out we don't actually necessarily need the other people. Just writing down your thoughts helps you to free up part of your brain that's been trying to hold on to them, so you can think of other things that make new connections. And of course, over time, we've used technology to help us with this, until finally, we've reached the peak. And I'm actually almost serious about this. Well, the next bit is serious. So it turns out that each of these stages in CBD requires a very different mindset, very different approach. You're like playing a different role. Now think back to, we talked about the brain being this big association machine. well, have you ever had the situation where you walked into a room and you can't remember why you came there? You go back to where you are and you remember it, because we're connected to our environment. So it affects our memory, but also affects our mental resources, how we approach things. So we take, again, cues, and then from that, we go into a certain state. So once you've done TBD enough, you start to naturally fall into this cycle where when you're writing the failing test, you have this requirements mindset. You're thinking like as an end user or a business expert or whoever it is that's making up the requirements. They're the thing you have in your mind. Your role is to write that down as code. And it's a very different thinking style to hacking away the code. But what happens is, because you've now written it down, you've externalized it, frees you up to then naturally transition to a different mental state where you can hack away the code and have fun doing it. Because you don't have to worry about the requirements anymore, the tests are doing that for you. Now your focus is making the test pass. And that singular focus, again, is what helps to make it fun. And bring different mental resources to the problem. And even going to the refactor step, again, it's a different set of mental processes. Rather than just hacking away at code to make it work, you've got to think about design principles. How do we make this more well factored, remove dependencies, all of that sort of thing, without worrying about requirements, without worrying about making it work in the first place. It's already working. It's a different type of thinking process, different mental resources, and the tests allow you to externalize your brain, freeing you up to make that transition freely. And that's why I really like to put the "are we done" step over there, because we're back over the line into that requirements mindset. So we're not thinking about "are we done" in terms of is there anything else cool I can do, but rather is there another requirement that needs to be addressed. So that in a nutshell is externalize your brain. So I should have been moving around like that as we went. There we go. That's the three areas I wanted to look at tonight. Habit forming, building a new habit around TDD, dopamine triggers to really take that to the next level and have fun doing so, and externalize your brain to make more use of the mental resources you already have at the right time. So, coming back to this list earlier, I think we can probably see how what I've been talking about, at least, whether I've convinced you or not, relates to the fun part and the keeping you focused part. That was the externalize your brain. What about the extra work and the slowing you down? They must still be true. Well, very quickly, because I'm running out of time, you've probably heard of shift left thinking or testing. I traced it back to this Dr. Dobbs article. But actually, the principle itself goes back longer than that. I first came across it in Code Complete, the first edition. Anybody read Code Complete? It's not so well known as it used to be. It's still a good read. But you've probably seen something like this, subcode development lifecycle, and the idea that things get more expensive to change or fix the later in the process. That's the idea behind shift left thinking. You move testing back to an earlier stage where it's cheaper. So by that principle, and it's not just cheaper in time, money, it's cheaper in time as well. So the earlier you catch issues, the less time it's going to take overall. That's the avoiding rework part. But there's more. Final question to leave you with. Why do cars have brakes? And again, I usually do this as an interactive exercise, but the first thing that comes to your mind is usually, so you can stop or slow down. But the correct answer, of course, is so you can go faster. Because how fast would you drive if your car didn't have brakes? How fast would you code if you didn't have tests? Is the obvious analog. The tests are there to stop you when things go wrong, not to slow you down. So there's something to think about. So we rush a bit at the end, so If it didn't convince you, but I think we've addressed all the points. And I'm at time, I had a few bonus slides, but do I have time to take another 1 minute?
Yeah.
Yep. Because my t-shirt, Shade X, is actually my own company. We're starting a new conference in the UK, Swiftcraft. Going to run next May. So I wanted to announce it here. And we already have keynote speakers lined up. Jessica Kerr, made her as Jessica Tron. Daniel Steinberg, I'm sure everybody knows Daniel. He's at like 90% of all the conferences, including mine. So, didn't want any FOMO. We just closed the call for speakers. We had 129 submissions, which I think is actually really good for a first year conference. And we've actually got all the speakers doing reviews of the other talks. And we so far had 678 reviews. So it's getting a lot of interest. And I actually want to open the reviews up to everyone here as well. It's anonymized, so you're not going to see who you're voting for, and it's all done comparatively. You just have to rank them. So what I'm going to do is send a link for that to the organisers to pass on to everyone, so you can all take part and shape what the program's going to look like for Swiftcraft, whether you want to go or not, but of course I hope you do want to go. Just to give you a little taste, this is the venue, down in Folkestone, Lee's Cliff Hall, some of you may know it. Built right into the hills or the cliffs next to the sea there. Back there, you can see the beach. It's a really interesting building, a lot of character. I hold another conference there, a C++ conference. Gets lots of really great feedback about the venue. There's a view from the back as well. If you get lucky with the weather, it's quite nice. But it's pretty good inside as well. So that's a little taster for Swiftcraft. Hope to see you there. URL, swiftcraft.uk, 21st to 24th of May. And I think I've overdone my time, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was a brilliant talk and very exciting new conference there. I'm sure the weather will hold up. This is Britain, after all. But yeah, fantastic talk. Learn a lot of biology, chemistry, psychology, and testing. A little bit sad I didn't see some C++ on a Tuesday evening, but I'll forgive you. So our next talk, I think we're going to